And the only daggers to be drawn now on BBC One are of the verbal variety, and purely in the interests of lively conversation, as Robin Day introduces Question Time.
Thank you and welcome to our 201st Question Time for 60 minutes of cut and thrust on topical questions raised by our audience here. Around the table with me, Mr. Norman Lamont MP, who is Minister of State for Defence Procurement in the department headed by Mr. Michael Heseltine until a week ago, and oh, what a week it's been. Mr. Lamont was previously a Minister in the Department of Industry under Norman Tebbit. So his experience in the Industry Department, now headed by Leon Britton, and in the Defence Department under Michael Heseltine, makes him an interesting person to have with us, just as the ongoing Westland drama approaches its climax in the Albert Hall tomorrow. Miss Harriet Harman, MP, is a Labour front bench speaker on health and social security. Before becoming an MP, Harriet Harman, who's a solicitor, was a legal officer with the National Council for Civil Liberties. You may remember she was involved in an important contempt of court case. That was when she showed confidential Home Office documents to a journalist after the documents had been read out in open court. Harriet Harman lost her case in the House of Lords, but I understand that she's now won it before the European Commission on Human Rights. Des Wilson is President-elect of the Liberal Party. He's a New Zealander who has made his name here as a social campaigner and pressure group activist over many years. First in 1967 when he founded Shelter, campaign for the homeless. He later became chairman of CLEAR, the campaign for lead-free air, chairman of the Friends of the Earth, and he's now chairman of the campaign for freedom of information. That's for getting rid of Section 2 of the Official Secrets Act, which curiously doesn't seem to have been enforced much in recent weeks, when certain well-known people have been scattering official secrets about like confetti. Donald Trelford is editor of The Observer and has been editor of The Observer for more than 10 years. That's a long time, you may think. But of course, a decade is not a long time in the history of a great newspaper like The Observer, which is the oldest Sunday newspaper in the world. His proprietor is Mr. Tiny Rowland of Lonhro. Mr. Trelford is also an author and a sportsman. He has a book coming out in a couple of weeks, which is about the sport of snooker. The book is called Snookered. There we are, and here we go. Mrs. Jane Lucas is our first questioner. She is a mother and a teacher. Mrs. Lucas, please. Thank you.
Thank you. James Pryor said this afternoon, the whole Westland saga has made us look foolish in the eyes of the world. Would the panel agree or disagree with this?
Des Wilson?
Yes and no, I would say. Firstly, I don't think the world think we're foolish for having a big public debate on this issue. They've tended to laugh at us because we don't have public debates on these issues. Too many decisions are sealed in secret and then just announced. So I think they realise it's important business and it's right and proper, it should be fully debated. What's made us look foolish, if not worse, is the behaviour of Mrs. Thatcher, Mr. Britton and some of her ministers, and the extent to which they've played two hands at once. On one hand, Mrs. Thatcher has wanted the Sikorsky deal all along, but she was quite happy to hide behind the fact that the company wanted it too. Only when Mr. Heseltine launched his campaign, she couldn't resist getting into the act as well, using Mr. Britton as a foot soldier. And of course, Mr. Britton went completely over the top, as always, in trying to serve Mrs. Thatcher, and now they've both got themselves in a pretty pickle. That makes us look foolish. It makes us look worse. It makes us look like we have a government that cannot be trusted to be straight, either with themselves or the people.
Mr. Lamont.
I rather agree with what James Pryor has said. I think that this is a national crisis, if you like, a debate about something that has got a bit out of perspective. I very much feel, I'm afraid, that Michael Heseltine has got the problem a little out of perspective. I know that he is very sincere indeed about what he believed about European collaboration. But I think what we've seen is not a great constitutional crisis. What we've seen is a clash of personalities within the cabinet. That is what essentially I think it is about. I think it is a terrible tragedy indeed that Michael Heseltine has left the government. I was very privileged to work with him. He was a very stimulating person to work for, and I'm extremely sad that he has left the government. I think that it is quite untrue, as Des Wilson has said, to say that the position of Mrs. Thatcher or of the government has been that of supporting the takeover by Sikorsky. The position of the government has been that it is up to shareholders, and I know that Mrs. Thatcher absolutely, passionately believes that it is not right for the government to dictate a solution either to the company or to shareholders, and that is her position.
Harriet Harman?
Well, I think the government not only look foolish in this, I think they also look slightly dishonest and incompetent. I think the way they've conducted their business, which has been very publicly revealed, shows that instead of a difference between two cabinet ministers being dealt with by discussion in the cabinet and being resolved, the difference has been resolved by manipulation, by leaking of letters, by pressure on the ministers, by pressure on the BBC, by pressure from the Home Office, from the Foreign Office, even to our allies. There's been a real sort of manipulation and mix-up. I think also the reason why the government's looked very bad indeed is that there's been a sort of clash. On the one hand, they say they're in favour of non-intervention. Let's leave it to the shareholders. It's nothing to do with us. But on the other hand, clearly that simply doesn't work when you're talking about important defence procurement and when you're talking about many, many jobs. And therefore, although their ideology is don't intervene, in practice they've been unable to resist intervening. And that means that when they've actually intervened, although their public position is that they won't, they've had to rely on deceit to cover that up.
Why does it make us look foolish in the eyes of the world? Are the whole world watching all this? I mean, are they... I mean, I don't quite understand why... I'm perfectly fair to make criticism of the government, but the question was in the eyes of the world.
Well, I certainly think America will be watching it with great interest, because if they get a foothold in Westland, then no doubt United Technologies and its subsidiaries will be looking to perhaps pick up shares and controlling interests in the other defence industries which the government currently plans to privatise.
Donald Telford,
can I just make a point about... You see, Westland is a very small firm, but coming up for selling of shares is what are currently, or at least have been, the Royal Ordnance factories. Those are the factories which make all the defence weapons like tanks and guns. And in fact, under Michael Heseltine, the Defence Ministry is going to sell those off. So we've got a little sort of mini version of what's going to happen in the summer with United Technologies, no doubt, and all sorts of other companies from other countries actually buying our Royal Ordnance factories, actually buying our weapon-making establishments. And that's one of the things that I find a bit mysterious about all this, is that Michael Heseltine appears to have discovered defence interests. Let's not actually sell, or, let's not let United Technologies take over because of the national interest. But it's a bit odd that he has pioneered not only the selling of the Royal Ordnance factories into private hands, but also selling off the management of the Royal Naval Dockyards. That means United Technologies could actually buy the management of the entire servicing of our fleet. So we're going to have large sections of our defence procurement industry in private hands.
Well, you've widened the issue there, Harriet. Let me ask Donald Telford. Do you think Jim Pryor is right? It's made us look foolish in the eyes of the world?
No, I don't think so at all. I think the very important principles have been established by Michael Heseltine. I think it was a crucial, important decision about the future of our defence industries, the choice between Europe and America in many cases. It won't always go the same way. I think it was right that it was brought into the open, and I think it raises fundamental issues also about decision-making in our kind of democracy and how far the public are allowed to become involved in that kind of decision-making. It really has been an extraordinary example of open government by default, almost, to have people, particularly Michael Heseltine, who's actually was instrumental in having civil servants prosecuted for leaks from his department, to find, all sorts of leaks are suddenly appearing all over the place, and then retaliatory leaks are appearing elsewhere, from ministers are constantly lecturing us about this matter, and indeed would like to see my own newspaper prosecuted, and doubtless will shortly, for that kind of thing. I think it's been an extraordinary exercise in open government. Some people have been made to look foolish. I think the government are looking very foolish indeed. There's an old saying, oh, what a tangled web we weave when first we practice to deceive. And the basic deception in this whole business was that the government claimed it was hands-off, we're not going to get involved, let the market decide, and then proceeded actually to try to influence the market. It was all right for the market as long as it was Sikorsky. They're getting the market. What they're getting now, they're getting the market red in tooth and claw with all the deceptions, the corruptions, the market forces, the money, everything pouring around their heads. And to say that government has no proper role in a decision of this magnitude affecting our national defence, the basic decision they made is coming home to roost.
Jane Lucas, what do you think?
Yes, I would agree with what James Pryor said. I think it is an important issue and it should be debated, and the world should be listening into what is happening. But the government does appear to seem to be untrustworthy in it.
Minister, would you like to just answer that simple point? There's Mrs. Lucas.
Well,
an ordinary, decent citizen, and I say that complimentarily and not otherwise. She thinks the government looks untrustworthy.
Well, there have been so many different allegations made about letters, leaks, meetings that were meant to take place and didn't take place, that it is obviously very difficult for one to reply to that in any blanket sort of way. And I think it's a very good thing that a select committee of the House of Commons are going to look into this, and they will be able to cross-examine both Mr. Heseltine and Mr. Britton and officials as well. I can only say, as someone who has been somewhere near the centre of this, that I believe when we look back on it years later, people will actually wonder what on earth it was really about, and they will find it very difficult to find a real issue at the centre of it. And what I think historians will conclude is that actually it was a clash of wills within the cabinet, and that was all it was, and that there was a lot of exaggerated talk about manipulation, twisting, and so on. That is what I believe will be the finding. But we are going to have a select committee of the House of Commons going into it, so we shall find out very soon. I would like to reply to what Harriet Harden
Let me just bring in some people.
Well.
You'll have another opportunity. I want to bring in some people, more people from the audience. Minister, just before I do that, did you think of resigning with Mr. Heseltine, your departmental chief?
I thought about it, and indeed I will say that I discussed it with one of my colleagues, but I differed from Michael Heseltine on the industrial case. I did not take the view that it was wrong for shareholders actually to make the decision. Of course, as Harriet Harman has said, in defence procurement, governments have to have a view, but the government looked at it, and the view the government came to was that the requirements defence-wise could be met either with the American alternative or with the European alternative. As for the constitutional issue, which is really, I think, in Michael Heseltine's mind, the more important point, I sympathised with some of the things that Michael felt frustrated about. But I'm bound to say, I don't actually think that at the end of the day it amounts to a constitutional issue. I think it does amount to a conflict of personalities within the cabinet.
Gentleman there, please. Thank you for that very interesting answer.
If we are not sure if the shareholders should make the decision or if the government should make the decision, why not let the workers decide which governance they will have, which employees they will choose to have?
Well, I won't put that to the whole channel, but under company law, the shareholders have to decide whether a certain reconstruction proposal recommended by the board is to go through. That's the law of companies. Let's just have the gentleman there. The workers have been given their vote.
The Minister just said, what is it all about? And this is the main question for the viewers. What is it all about? It's only a few weeks ago since we saw Mr. Heseltine signing a treaty with his American counterpart, Mr. Weinberger, which pledged Britain to supply America with all the technical know-how behind the Star Wars program. No European country would touch it. And now we see Mr. Heseltine wearing a European hat. And it seems to me that there is something, not quite straightforward.
What do you think about that?
You're absolutely right to identify the America-Europe thing as what it's all about. In my view, it's basically a choice between Mrs. Thatcher's desire to continue to look backwards towards the Atlantic relationship instead of looking forward to where our future markets lie and our industrial future lies, which is in Europe. But I would just like to challenge Norman Lamont's view of what history will decide about this event. He says history will say it was just a storm in a teacup. I believe history will record it as the moment when Mrs. Thatcher's whole rotten edifice began to crumble. She's had 16 ministers leave her cabinet in 6 years, an extraordinary number. Most of
14,
them by far.
14.
By far the most
14
able.
ministers.
All right, I'll accept 14, Robin. It's
16
still,
if you include the minor ministers.
It's all right, I'll include the minor ministers.
That's not from the cabinet.
All right, Robin. Have we sorted
Don't
that out?
over-egg the pudding.
All right, have we sorted that one out?
14's a hell of a lot. I'm sorry to stop you in your flow. Move on.
Thank you very much. 14 ministers in 6 years. Most of the able people who were in her original cabinet. She has become world-renowned for her autocratic approach. And what has happened here is that she's got her ministers to the point where when the order goes out, this is what Thatcher wants, they are afraid to fail. And that is why Leon Brittan got himself in a situation where Sir Raymond Ligo, former captain of the Ark Royal, former admiral, head of British Aerospace, fled that building the other night and went back to his board of directors and, according to the letter to the Prime Minister, asked for protection. Asked for the protection of his board. This man, who was fit to face the Russians, needed defense of his board of directors against a British minister.
Donald Trump.
Well, I thought Norman Lamont was talking interesting code language when he talked about the constitutional lessons. Well, the main constitutional lesson we've learnt, as I understand it, is that nobody's been allowed to finish a sentence in the cabinet for 3 years, except for this. And I'm quite sure that history will show, first of all, on the European-American thing, there is no absolute choice for Britain in any era between Europe and America. We're going to have to choose different ones according to different needs. After all, America is our partner in NATO. I happen to think it's not anti-American to have a European consortium to build helicopters. America needs us as a powerful partner within the Atlantic Alliance, and a strong European defence industry would actually save them a lot of cost and trouble in the long run.
I'd like to bring in, on this same subject, but a new aspect, Jonathan Slater, who's a research analyst for British Rail. Would you like to ask your question, Mr. Slater?
Thank you.
Yes, please.
The general public and even members of Parliament are finding it almost impossible to decide who is and who isn't telling the truth about the Westland affair because of government secrecy and efforts to cover up. Would the panel agree that certain cabinet minutes and other government papers should be more freely available? And if so, how much more?
Harriet Harman, bearing in mind that you may or may not be a cabinet minister yourself before very long.
I think that there is obsessive secrecy in this country. The presumption is that unless a minister or somebody in high authority actually says a government document or a bit of information about the government is available for the public, then it must be secret. I mean, most governments operate the other way round, that unless there's some reason for it to be secret, it should be open. Now, I think what we've had, we wouldn't have known anything about Admiral Sir Raymond Ligo's ding-dong with Leon Brittan had it not been for the fact that one cabinet minister pulled the plugs. Otherwise, we would have known nothing about that. And we have actually glimpsed in to a system which is usually closed and private. And I think that the country does suffer from that secrecy. For a start, I think you have better decision-making if you can actually have the public well-informed and then other people can actually partake in the debate. Otherwise, the government does it very much on its own and can't benefit from other people's views because there's not a wide discussion.
So if the next Labour government under Mr. Kinnock comes in, cabinet meetings, we're going to have all the details the next day, are we? And the law officer's advice is going to be on the front page of the newspapers?
We will have an ethos of openness. We'll have a... That is very important. We'll have we'll abolish Section 2 of the Official Secrets Act, which says everything's secret unless it's authorised. We'll have a Freedom of Information Act. But the other point I was going to make about the importance of opening up government is that I think that at the moment, the balance of power, it's not necessarily shown in this case, but generally it is, that the balance of power, because of the secrecy, rests more with the civil servants and less with the ministers, because the civil servants only tell ministers what they want them to know, and the rest of nobody else actually knows, and therefore the ministers only have one channel of communication and information, and nobody else is allowed to have this information. I think that, in fact, decision-making as a whole would improve drastically if it was opened out.
Donald Trafford?
I couldn't agree more. I think in America, there's a classic example, the Freedom of Information Act. It appears to be working very well. We all had a report on that from Ralph Nader, who's been in Britain the last few days, explaining what difference it's made to the quality of their democracy. Public business is seen as the public's business. It's our business. It's things that are done in our name and with our money, and we're really entitled to know extremely little. In this country, we don't realise, actually, how little we're allowed to know compared with everywhere else. Many of the viewers will have been watching earlier the Yes Minister and getting a real flavour of how things are done. And anybody who really wants to know the truth about that meeting between LIGO and Liam Britton only needs to watch Yes Minister to get the real flavour of what was going on there. I mean, Sir Humphrey has saved his minister again, in my view. But doubtless the committee will show. But as for the question of information, it affects the press directly. Therefore, it affects the quality of information that the democracy, the people receive, and on which they're able to base their decisions. The information is regarded as government property with a stamp on it. It can only be released by authorised individuals. It is therefore parcelled out in small bits at a time to the favoured few, and those favoured few journalists who don't actually present it in the way it's intended to be presented are then starved of information in the future.
Now, you're making the familiar case against restriction, but Mr. Slater wants to know how much more should information be freely available? We can all say it's far too shut up, but how far would you go?
I'd have a Freedom of Information Act in which there would be an automatic presumption, as Harriet Harman said, in favour of openness, because that is the definition of democracy. There is a presumption in favour of openness. You then have certain reserved categories which can be argued out by judicial review, in which it can be argued that if you need this information, you must apply for it.
But take the law officer's opinion to the law officer's opinion, which was sent to Mr. Heseltine about his letter to the banker, saying he was inaccurate. Should that be freely open to the public?
Yes, I don't see why that shouldn't be made freely open to the public in the context at that time, yes.
What law officer will ever want to give an opinion if it's going to be public the next day?
Well, it wasn't an opinion in that sense, was it? I mean, it was
all right, a letter. You've been materially inaccurate.
It was a contribution to a public debate, and it was made public as part of a public debate, partisan on one side as an anti-Heseltine move.
Are your lawyer's advice as editor of The Observer made public?
I don't see why not.
I've never seen them.
Well, no.
Well, I think that Donald Telford's position is actually an absurd position. I do agree that we need more open government, and there is a lot of routine information, a lot of information that Parliament could have in order to make more informed views. But I think it's a denial of government to think that the working documents, the negotiations between ministers at the moment that they actually happen, the advice from law officers, could be made public immediately. People wouldn't adopt positions. They wouldn't argue their corners. They would be very careful what they put in the documents. I do think that there is a lot. My goodness, we've had open government in the last few weeks, but that isn't quite how we want to have it. What we want to have is a reform of the Official Secrets Act, and we want to have the removal of the blanket provision of Section 2. We want to have a distinction between information that relates to the security of the country, defence, and we want to have a lesser offence, a lesser classification, and we want to have a mechanism that makes more routine information available.
Is that government policy?
That was what we tried to do when we introduced a bill to reform the Official Secrets Act. The trouble was that Parliament decided that it didn't actually like the categorisation of the different security interests, and they threw it out. We did attempt to reform the Official Secrets Act, but what we learned was it is very difficult to get a consensus in Parliament precisely how that should be done.
But is the removal of Section 2 of the Official Secrets Act, which you've just called for, is that government policy? But it's only a week or two since they were prosecuting people at the Old Bailey under Section 2. Donald Trump stands in daily terror.
The government attempted to introduce a bill that would have removed the blanket provision of Section 2. What we haven't said is that we're going to do that again tomorrow. But obviously the government did think, when it attempted to do that, that that was a good thing to do.
So after 6 years, you've done nothing?
Well, it is extreme. We actually did more than the last Labour government.
Well,
we actually got round to introducing a bill.
Des Wilson, you're the chairman of this campaign for freedom of information.
Well, Norman Lamont is right. They have done more than any other. They've used Section 2 more than any other administration since the Act was introduced. They have leaked like a sieve themselves whenever they wish, with unattributable briefings and all sorts of leaks. It's all right for Heseltine and Breton to do it, but a 23-year-old clerk called Sarah Tisdall is sent to prison for 6 months. If Norman Lamont believes what he said, and I agreed with every word of it, repeal Section 2, introduce freedom of information and whatever, then I have to say to him that he must say it loudly. I offer him a place on our platform every time we have a public meeting, and let him join our campaign to persuade the Prime Minister. Well, there are two fundamental points that should be made about information. The first is that it's ours. It's collected on our behalf, at our expense, by our servants. And it's extraordinary that our servants can actually collect that information and say, you, the masters, cannot have it. And if we're going to have any kind of control in our democracy at all, as it gets more and more centralized, we have got to get access to information. The second point is, we're not talking about some radical and revolutionary dream that's never been tried. Freedom of information works very effectively in countries with a similar constitution as ours, New Zealand, Canada, Australia, incidentally introduced in all of those countries by a Conservative administration. What we're talking about here when we talk about secrecy, in my view, is the very starting point to solving our nation's problems. Because until we become better educated and more in control of our public servants and our ministers, we will not be able to reverse the decline that has continued for so long.
Mr. Slater, what do you think of the answers you've heard?
I found it surprising that Norman Lamont should argue for a more open government and earlier support Mr. Britton and Mrs. Thatcher when Mr. Britton denied having seen a letter saying private and strictly confidential. He didn't just not tell us what was in it. He denied actually receiving it.
Well, I'm not going to bring Mr. Lamont in because Mr. Britton wasn't saying that was an official secret. He was saying that Sir Austin Pearce had written the letter with private, therefore he couldn't abuse his confidential. That's a different point. Why are you surprised he should be in favour of doing away with the Official Secrets Act?
Because his government uses it. And they use it very effectively.
We have to apply the law as it is. There is a need. There is. Well, it was said that there had been enormous number of prosecutions under Section 2. There have been 7 cases since 1979. The case of Sarah Tisdall was referred to as though somehow this was a trivial matter. I think, quite honestly, that the information that she released relating to the arrival of cruise missiles in this country, I think it is quite wrong for a civil servant to release information of that kind to the public.
It wasn't about that.
Let's not go over the Tisdall case, please. We can't try
even if the Official Secrets Act were reformed under any administration, there would always be a category of information relating to defence and the security of the country where there would have to be precautions.
Donald Trump, would you answer that point, that particular point?
I think we'd all accept that. Clearly, there has to be, in our international dealings, this is recognised in the American Freedom of Information Act, that there are areas, reserved areas of security and international relations where there have to be reservations. But I agree with what Des Wilson was saying. We need to change the atmosphere in which the whole of politics is conducted if we are to convince a younger generation that it's to do with them. If it looks as though it's just for a bureaucracy and a few people to know about these things, and they're leaked out in these unreliable methods to the public feels there's a game going on there that's nothing to do with
Let's see what the public do feel. The lady there, please.
If Mr. Wilson and Miss Harman feel it's so important now to repeal Section 2, why have the successive Labour governments never done so?
Harriet Harman?
Yeah. Well, they should have done. They should have done, and they didn't. We are now committed to doing it. I mean, we've actually got a new commitment in that respect. Can I just say about what Norman Lamont said? It really is not the government's position. He's being disingenuous about that. Clement Freud introduced a bill which would repeal Section 2 with the savings about security and, national interest that, would be wanted, in line with other European and governments and American laws, and the government opposed it. And the Contempt of Court Act was introduced by this government, which actually extended secrecy very significantly to reporting of court proceedings and actually made what goes on in our courts more secretive. So they've actually gone in the other direction. It's not that they actually haven't found the right bit of legislation. They've turned down the legislation that would do and rolled on the boundaries of secrecy in the meantime.
Couple more comments, please. Yes, sir?
I think the whole business says Michael Heseltine's resignation. It has shown the autocratic ways that Mrs. Thatcher is imposing on her cabinet and the way she likes to govern this country.
Well, we were discussing that about 10 minutes ago. We're on the question of secrecy, but you're quite entitled to raise it. The gentleman over there. Yes, sir, with your hand up.
Yes, certainly.
No, the one on the back. Yes.
Is it likely that Michael Heseltine will be prosecuted under the Official Secrets Act, or is it one law for the rich and another one for the poor?
Well, I don't want Donald Telford to give us an opinion, but the position is if a minister authorises the release of a secret, then that's not breaking the Official Secrets Act. But it's a very complicated matter. The gentleman there? Yes, sir.
Yes. Des Wilson, you made the point about constitutional reform being needed to help us progress as a nation, but surely the biggest single reform would be a fair voting system so that the government would have a broader basis and be less centralised and autocratic.
Des Wilson's answer to that is yes, but we won't. We'll move on because we've discussed this many times. Forgive me, Des. Mr. Frank Corrie, who is a company proprietor. You have a question, sir.
Mr. Justice Popperwell's report on football safety at sports grounds recommends that cricket and rugby supporters be subjected to the same infringement of civil liberties that football supporters suffer from the police. Why should this be so when there is no recorded history of trouble in these sports?
Donald Telford, not only as an editor, but I believe you're on MCC committees, aren't you?
Yes, I mean, I share the questioner's astonishment that rugby and cricket should actually be thrown into the same areas here because they do not have the same records. I mean, heaven knows they might even throw snooker in next, might be what the world come to. I think the big weakness with Popperwell, with all these kind of reports, is that they come such a long time afterwards and the kind of problems they're dealing with are so intractable, ultimately. Safety at football grounds, for example, a crucial question, directly relevant to the question of violence. I went with my father to see Arsenal play Spurs on New Year's Day. It's one of the rare times somebody on a Sunday newspaper can go and see a football match is on a bank holiday. And one sensed again how old-fashioned the whole thing is. I mean, it's for another era, and the way you're rushed in and out to the grounds, and, you know, it really is cattle-like. And I think it creates an atmosphere which is undignified for people. A friend from the States who's just gone over there to be our correspondent was telling me he'd taken his family to see an American football game, and it was a genuinely happy family occasion. And there'd be no question of anybody making any trouble there. They'd really be thrown out. There'd be no nonsense. Somehow, I think it goes back to grounds. You're not going to reform grounds at a time when the football is in such a poor financial condition, and I think there ought to be some contribution from government. They take a great deal out of the game in the betting levies and so on, and I think a proportion of that should go back into the game if these recommendations which come up periodically are to mean anything at all.
Harriet Harman, particularly on the civil liberty aspects which concern the questioner?
Well, Mr. Justice Popperwell was dealing with two quite separate issues, actually. One was the question of safety, such as fire safety, and I think it is right that cricket and rugby should be included, where people, large numbers of the public gather in public places. It's obviously right that there should be a public responsibility to investigate those places to make sure they're safe from fire.
Hold on there, but you wouldn't disagree, irrespective of sport, that must be so.
Yes, I think
okay,
that's right.
Carry on.
Well, that's one of the recommendations he made. As far as the question about infringements of civil liberties is concerned, I think that when people actually go into a ground, whether it be cricket or whether it be football, they're actually going in voluntarily, and if the organisers feel that it is necessary to conduct searches, well, if you don't want to be searched, then you actually have got a choice of not going in. That's the same with airports, for example. If you go into an airport, you routinely get searched. Now, where I do, so I don't object to that, searching by the actual organisers of the event. But what I do object to is the suggestion of Mr. Justice Popplewell that there need to be more police powers to control violence. I think that this is wrong-headed. It's already a criminal offence to throw a bottle at somebody. It's already a criminal offence to hit somebody. It's a criminal offence even to threaten somebody or be insulting to them. The problem is not the amount of powers the police have got. Those offences are already there. The problem is actually stopping the disorder generating, actually stopping
But on the question
disorder
of searching,
spreading.
Mr. Justice Popplewell was told by chief constables, I understand, that they didn't have enough power to search people because they don't at the moment have the power to search unless they have reasonable cause. But they want it to be said that if somebody comes to a football match, then there is a reasonable cause to search them. But that isn't the law at the moment.
When people are going to, it's completely unnecessary, because when people are going into a football match, they can be searched actually as they go in, as a condition of them going in. And they then, if they don't want to be searched, I mean, they could be searched for drink or weapons as they actually go through. And there's nothing to do with legal powers there. It actually can be required by the organisers of the football
Well, that's
match.
why he
and
made
therefore
the
it's nothing to do
recommendation.
with the police. But as far as police searching powers is concerned, the police have enormously wide powers of search as it is, and can more or less search at random. And that does less to detect and prevent crime and more to irritate people and to alienate people. And in fact, the trouble with the police is that they seem to have a knee-jerk reaction of always saying they want more legal powers. It's not legal powers that's the problem.
Des Wilson?
Well, I wouldn't be too worried about some kind of light search of people entering football grounds, particularly if the police have reason to believe that there's trouble ahead. My criticism of the Popplewell report is that it tends to tackle the symptoms instead of the cause. In particular, I believe if you treat people like animals, they'll end up acting like animals. And the facilities in most of our football grounds and sporting facilities are appalling. If you go, as Donald says, to American football grounds, the customers have proper seating, proper facilities in every respect, and as a result, enjoy the afternoon out in a much better atmosphere. Now, I do think that if football clubs are going to continue to pack people into their grounds and make money from doing it, they have got to spend the money to make their customers comfortable and to create circumstances where peace is more likely. My other criticism of Popplewell is on the other side of his report about hazards and dangers, in that he doesn't tackle one of the fundamental causes of the Bradford fire, which was that the football club had twice been warned by the safety authorities that the grandstand was a fire hazard, but the warning, here we go again on secrecy, was marked confidential. Had that warning been published in the local newspapers, the football club would have been forced to act immediately and the lives would have been saved. And I think that we should recommend that all warnings by public health and safety authorities to football clubs and other public institutions should be automatically published at the time they're given.
Minister.
Well, I haven't had the opportunity to study the report, nor did I hear the Home Secretary's statement today. I think what is proposed about safety regulations must be unexceptionable. I think also the analysis that Mr. Popplewell has put forward of the causes of crowd violence, that is no doubt valuable. I've only just seen a summary of it on the tapes. I'm a little surprised at what he's recommended about executive boxes being free of the restrictions on alcohol. I'm slightly surprised at that. I think the Home Secretary has said, according to the tapes anyway, that he's not taking any action on the anti-hooligan crowd elements of the report. And I think that must be the right reaction to look at it and have a period of consideration.
Mr. Corrie, what do you think?
Well, I don't think they answered the question, in fact. The question was, why should this be so when there is no recorded history of trouble in these sports?
The extension to rugby and...
Yeah. I mean, one of the essential problems is, I come from the southwest of the country. We have football teams. Every time there's a football match, there are N number of police drafted into the football grounds, which means there are N number of police out of circulation in the community. A lot of people in the area that I come from are afraid in their own homes. They're afraid to walk the street late at night. There are 4 community policemen in an area of nearly 4 square miles. And as the chief superintendent told me, they just don't have the manpower to cover these things. Now, if they're going to pull more people out of the community to police areas where there has been no trouble, doesn't that indicate that the areas they leave, there will be more trouble?
What do you say to that, Des Wilson? Do you say that's do you accept that as an argument against extending these measures to rugby and cricket grounds if they're of a sufficient size?
Well, I do think the point that the gentleman made, that there's been no indication of the measure being justified in those sports, is a good one. And simply from a point of view of making better use of police resources, I think it's a good point. So, yes, I do basically agree with you on that.
Can we have, yes, gentleman there?
At the Millwall-Luton game recently, the fans pulled off the seats which a club had kindly provided. What does Mr Wilson think about that?
I think they were very foolish.
Any more comments on this? Yes, sir.
Yes, I wonder whether it's really a question of attitude. The gentleman down here is talking about football as opposed to rugby and cricket. Now, there have been scenes at some of the cricket finals recently at Lord's. There's a certain amount of hooliganism there where people run across the pitch. I've been to the rugby sevens, the Middlesex sevens at Twickenham. You don't need a search there. You can see the chaps walking through the gates with gallon plastic containers of beer around their neck. And there is a lot of drunkenness there. But it seems to be a question of attitude. There is a humour at cricket and football cricket and rugby matches, and also the other point about that is I feel that there's an awful lot of football supporters who actually support cricket and also rugby, and yet they're in a different environment.
Okay, Donald Truffle, you seem to be the expert on the various different sports. What do you say to this basic point that violence at rugby and cricket matches is jolly violence?
Well, I mean, nobody's talking about the civil liberties of the chap in the middle of the rugby scrum who gets trodden on, or the cricketer who gets hit with a bouncer and breaks his arm. But Popplewell does raise the question of the degree to which the participants in the sport, the stars in the sport, many of them suddenly raised to richness and fame, are setting a very bad example. And I think we all see that in a number of sports, particularly, I mean, if a rugby match gets out of control and there's a bit of kicking, the referee doesn't get control, it does affect the crowd. I think it does happen in soccer where if somebody takes a foul very badly or takes a goal very badly, it affects one side of the crowd or the other. And I think a lot of it's to do with players who've suddenly become very rich and are not really mature enough to cope with the situation they're thrown into.
Well, let's move on, if we may, to another very important question. Howard Palmer, who is a lecturer in international banking and a counsellor. Mr. Palmer, your question, please.
Thank you, Sir Robin. Now that Mr. Gorbachev has made concrete proposals for arms reductions in the face of American arms supremacy, do the panel feel that the whole concept of unilateral disarmament has been proved totally bankrupt?
Des Wilson.
No, I don't. I don't think you can draw that conclusion, nor do I think we need to. I think the far more important thing, if you'll forgive me redirecting your question slightly, is to ask what should we do now he's made it? Because I would not have believed even a few months ago that a Russian leader would actually be talking about the elimination of nuclear weapons from the planet in 15 years. And what I think we should do is take that offer at face value and respond as positively as possible, as quickly as possible. And I hope Norman Lamont will go, if he's one of those ministers still left, he will stand up to Mrs. Thatcher and urge her for once not to respond aggressively and negatively to the Soviet offer. The other point I'd like to make is that we should not assume that at this crucial stage, this is just an American-Russian thing. There were so many things we could immediately do in this country to respond to the Gorbachev offer, including cancelling Trident, which we can't afford anyway, cancelling testing, and encouraging the earliest possible freeze on all weapons.
But Mr. Palmer's basic point is that his argument is that Mr. Gorbachev's offer, which you approve of, would never have been made had not the Americans kept their nuclear strength.
And I repeat, I don't think you can draw the conclusion. You could try and draw the conclusion. My own view is that you should at least just consider the possibility that Mr. Gorbachev and a lot of the Russian people want peace, like most of the British people and the American people want peace.
Donald Trafford.
I think